The Great Hall of the Galactic Military Academy buzzed with nervous energy as hundreds of cadets from across the galaxy gathered for the most important challenge of their careers. Admiral Zarath stood at the center of the massive chamber, her forearms crossed behind her back as she surveyed the young beings before her. The blue-skinned Altarian commander had seen countless graduation ceremonies, but today felt different. Today they would face the Crimson Nebula campaign. Jake Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying not to stare at the incredible variety of alien life forms around him. The human exchange student from Earth had been at the academy for only 3 months, but he still felt like an outsider. Next to him sat his fellow humans, Lisa Carter, a sharp-eyed woman who had worked on Wall Street before joining the military program. Ryan Kelly, whose fingers never stopped moving as if he were playing an invisible video game. Amy Rodriguez, quiet and observant with dark eyes that missed nothing. And Tyler Brooks, who seemed to treat everything like a business negotiation. The 5 humans were the first of their species to attend the prestigious academy. Most of the other cadets viewed them with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed disdain. Earth was considered a death world by galactic standards, a harsh, violent planet that produced equally harsh and violent inhabitants. The fact that humans had only recently made contact with galactic civilization made them seem primitive and backward to many of their classmates. Admiral Zarath activated the massive holographic display that dominated the center of the hall. Immediately, a 3-dimensional map of 17 star systems appeared, each one marked with different colored indicators showing fleet positions, resource centers, and political boundaries. The complexity was overwhelming. Trade routes crisscrossed the display like glowing spiderwebs, while thousands of ship icons moved slowly through space in predetermined patterns. "Cadets," Admiral Zarath began, her voice carrying easily through the chamber's advanced acoustics. "What you see before you is the most challenging military simulation ever created. The Crimson Nebula campaign recreates the bloodiest conflict in our galaxy's recorded history. For 10 years, our best strategists, our most advanced artificial intelligences, and our greatest military minds have attempted to find a solution to this scenario. None have succeeded." A murmur ran through the assembled cadets. Many had heard rumors about the impossible simulation, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. The sheer scale was breathtaking. Managing even a single star system would be challenging enough, but 17 systems with thousands of variables each seemed beyond the capabilities of any single mind. The Admiral continued her explanation. "The scenario places you in command of the United Coalition forces at the beginning of the Third Galactic War. You must coordinate fleets numbering over 10,000 vessels, manage resources across multiple star systems, and maintain political alliances with 12 different species, each with their own agenda and cultural requirements. Meanwhile, you face an enemy that is technologically superior, numerically advantaged, and fighting on 3 separate fronts." Jake glanced at his human teammates. Lisa was taking notes on a small electronic pad, her business background showing, as she tried to understand the economic implications of the scenario. Ryan was studying the ship movement patterns with the intense focus he usually reserved for strategy games. Amy watched the political boundaries shift and change, already calculating how cultural differences might be exploited. Tyler was examining the resource allocation systems with the eye of someone who had spent years managing complex corporate deals. "The simulation runs in accelerated time," Admiral Zarath explained. 1 hour of real time equals approximately 6 months of campaign time. Most cadet teams are eliminated within the first simulated year, as their forces are overwhelmed by the superior enemy capabilities. The few teams that survive longer typically reach a stalemate that can last for the equivalent of several years before they are finally defeated. Around the hall, alien cadets were already forming their strategic groups. The Altarians, with their methodical approach to problem-solving, had spent months creating detailed battle plans. Their leader, a brilliant young strategist named Veltar, had written a 500-page analysis of the historical campaign, complete with supply, chain calculations, and fleet deployment schedules. The Centaurians were equally prepared. Their analytical minds had broken down every aspect of the simulation into mathematical formulas. Crixnall, their team leader, carried a device containing over 10,000 different strategic scenarios, each one calculated to account for every possible enemy response. Other species had their own approaches. The diplomatic vegan delegation had prepared extensive negotiation strategies for managing the 12-species alliance. The militaristic Spartan Empire cadets had memorized every weapon system and ship specification in the simulation. The technologically advanced Andromedans had developed new algorithms for optimizing resource distribution. The human team stood out for their apparent lack of preparation, while other groups carried elaborate strategic documents and complex analytical tools. The humans seemed almost casual about the whole affair. They had spent their preparation time doing things that baffled their alien classmates, playing simple games on their personal devices, watching historical documentaries about Earth conflicts, and engaging in what appeared to be random conversations about topics completely unrelated to military strategy. "Your species approaches warfare very differently than ours," observed Zenthali, a tall, graceful being from the Stellar Consortium. She had been assigned as a liaison to help the human cadets understand galactic military doctrine. "We have studied your history, and it appears that humans engage in conflict with an unusual level of creativity." Jake wasn't sure if that was meant as a compliment or an insult. Human military history was indeed violent and chaotic compared to the orderly rule-based warfare practiced by most galactic civilizations. Where other species preferred predictable strategies based on mathematical calculations and established doctrine, humans had a tendency to improvise, adapt, and use whatever methods worked, regardless of whether those methods were considered proper or civilized. "The simulation will begin in 30 minutes, Admiral Zarath announced. "Teams should take their positions at the command interfaces. Remember, this is not merely a test of your tactical abilities. The Crimson Nebula campaign has frustrated our greatest minds because it requires more than just following established military doctrine. It demands innovation, adaptability, and the ability to think beyond conventional limitations." As the cadets moved toward their assigned stations, Jake noticed the confidence radiating from the alien teams. They had prepared extensively, studied every historical precedent, and developed comprehensive strategies based on centuries of galactic military tradition. They moved with the certainty of beings who knew exactly what they were going to do and how they were going to do it. The human team, by contrast, seemed almost relaxed. They hadn't spent months in preparation because, as Ryan had pointed out, they didn't really understand galactic military doctrine well enough to follow it properly. Instead, they planned to approach the simulation the same way they approached most problems, by figuring it out as they went along. "So," Lisa said as they took their positions at the command interface, "anyone actually know what we're supposed to do here?" Tyler grinned. "Win, I assume. How hard can it be?" Amy shook her head at his confidence, but she was smiling too. "Just remember, we're representing our entire species here. Try not to start any interstellar incidents." "No promises," Jake replied, settling into the command chair and studying the interface before him. The controls were designed for beings with 4 arms and 2 heads, making them awkward for humans to operate. But that was just another problem to solve, and humans were very good at solving problems, even when their solutions didn't follow the rulebook. Around them, the other teams were making final preparations, running through their carefully planned strategies one last time. The air hummed with tension and anticipation. In 30 minutes, they would face the challenge that had defeated the best military minds in the galaxy for a decade. Jake looked at his teammates and felt a familiar surge of confidence. They might not understand galactic military doctrine, but they understood something else: how to adapt, how to improvise, and how to win against impossible odds. It was, after all, what humans did best. The moment the simulation began, the great hall filled with the soft hum of dozens of command interfaces coming to life. Holographic displays flickered and stabilized, showing the opening positions of the Crimson Nebula campaign. Admiral Zarath and her staff took their positions at the observation deck, ready to monitor what they expected would be another long, frustrating demonstration of the simulation's impossible difficulty. Across the hall, the alien cadet teams immediately began implementing their carefully prepared strategies. Feltar, the Altarian strategist, opened his massive tactical manual and began issuing orders according to the historical precedent set by Admiral Corveth during the original campaign. His team moved with mechanical precision, establishing supply lines and defensive positions exactly as the textbooks recommended. The Centaurian team under Crixnall took a different but equally methodical approach. Their mathematical minds began calculating optimal resource distribution patterns, while their fleet commanders positioned ships according to algorithms that had been tested and refined over months of preparation. Every move was deliberate, every decision backed by extensive analysis. At the human command station, chaos seemed to reign. Jake Morrison stared at the interface for exactly 30 seconds before turning to his teammates with a puzzled expression. "Okay, so we're supposed to be the good guys, right? And those red markers are the bad guys?" "That's usually how it works," Lisa replied, already studying the economic data streaming across her screen. Her experience with financial markets was kicking in as she watched resource prices fluctuate across the 17 star systems. But look at this. The enemy has better technology and more ships, but their economy is completely centralized. One major disruption could cascade through their entire system. Ryan was examining the fleet movement patterns with growing excitement. This is just like Empire Wars, but with better graphics. Look, the AI enemies are following predetermined patrol routes. They're not actually intelligent, they're just following really complex scripts. Amy had pulled up the political data and was shaking her head in amazement. These 12 allied species hate each other almost as much as they hate the enemy. The only reason they're working together is because they're more afraid of losing than they are of cooperating. That's not an alliance. That's a hostage situation. Tyler was poking at the interface controls, trying to figure out how to operate systems designed for beings with 4 arms. "So let me get this straight. We're supposed to fight a war using the same strategies that failed in real life, against an enemy that knows exactly what we're going to do, while managing allies who don't trust each other?" "That's about right," Jake confirmed. "Well, that's stupid," Tyler said matter-of-factly. "Why would we do that?" It was such a simple question that it stopped all 5 humans in their tracks. Around them, the other teams were busy following established protocols, implementing time-tested strategies, and adhering to the accepted principles of galactic warfare. But none of them had stopped to ask whether those principles actually made sense. Jake looked at the tactical display again, this time with fresh eyes. The enemy forces were positioned exactly where the historical records said they would be. Their supply lines followed the same routes that had been used in the original campaign. Their fleet movements matched the patterns that every cadet had been taught to expect. It was all very predictable, very orderly, and very much like fighting an enemy who had given you their battle plans in advance. "What if we don't follow the script?" Jake asked quietly. Lisa looked up from her economic analysis. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if we don't do what we're supposed to do? What if we don't follow the historical precedent or the textbook strategies? What if we just try to win?" Amy nodded slowly. "The other teams are trying to solve this like it's a historical recreation. They're trying to do better than the original commanders by following the same basic approach, but we don't know the historical precedent well enough to follow it even if we wanted to. And that might actually be an advantage," Ryan added, his fingers already moving across the interface. "If the enemy AI is programmed to respond to traditional galactic military doctrine, then non-traditional approaches might confuse it." Tyler was grinning now. "So we're going to cheat?" "We're going to improvise," Jake corrected. "There's a difference." The first sign that something unusual was happening came when the human team began making moves that didn't match any known strategic doctrine, while other teams were carefully building up their defenses and establishing secure supply lines. The humans immediately began what appeared to be a completely reckless offensive across multiple fronts. But it wasn't reckless. It was calculated chaos. Lisa had identified 3 key economic bottlenecks in the enemy supply chain. By attacking those specific points simultaneously, she could crash their resource distribution system and force them to choose between defending their economy or their military assets. Ryan had spotted something that the simulation designers had never intended. The enemy patrol patterns had gaps that could be exploited if you were willing to risk sending small, fast ships through dangerous regions of space. It was the kind of high-risk, high-reward strategy that galactic military doctrine would never approve, but it could put human forces behind enemy lines within hours instead of months. Amy was working on what she called alliance management, but what looked more like corporate espionage to outside observers. Instead of trying to coordinate with all 12 allied species equally, she was identifying which ones had the most to gain from human success and which ones were likely to switch sides if the war started going badly. Rather than treating the alliance as a single entity, she was managing it like a collection of individual business relationships. Tyler had taken on the role of what he called strategic communications, which seemed to involve sending messages to enemy commanders that were either completely honest or completely false, depending on which would be more confusing. He was treating the entire enemy leadership structure like a corporate board that could be manipulated through careful information management. Jake coordinated it all, switching between different aspects of the campaign with a speed that amazed the alien observers. Most galactic species preferred to focus on one problem at a time, solving issues in sequence and maintaining clear chains of command. But Jake was simultaneously managing a resource war, a propaganda campaign, a multi-front military offensive, and a complex alliance negotiation, treating each one as just another variable in a larger equation. The alien cadet teams began to notice that something was wrong when their carefully planned strategies started encountering unexpected resistance. The enemy forces weren't responding the way they were supposed to. Supply lines that should have been secure were under attack. Fleet movements that should have been predictable were being intercepted by ships that had no business being in those sectors. Beltar stared at his tactical display in confusion. According to his calculations, the human sector should have been overrun within the first simulated month. Instead, human forces were advancing on 3 different fronts while somehow maintaining their defensive positions. It didn't make sense. According to any military doctrine he had studied, Crixnall was having similar problems. His mathematical models predicted that the human team would be eliminated quickly due to their obvious lack of preparation and their failure to follow established protocols, but the data streaming across his screen showed human forces gaining ground at an impossible rate. "What are they doing?" Veltar asked, his voice carrying a note of panic that was unusual for the normally composed Altarian. "I don't know," Crixnall replied, all 4 of his eyes focused on the tactical display. "They're not following any recognizable strategy. They're attacking and defending simultaneously, managing their economy like a gambling operation, and treating their allies like business partners instead of military units. It's complete chaos." But it was working. Somehow, impossibly, the human approach was working. The enemy forces, programmed to respond to traditional military strategies, were being systematically dismantled by tactics that no civilized species would ever consider using. Admiral Zarath watched from the observation deck with growing amazement. In less than 20 minutes of simulation time, equivalent to 2 months of campaign time, the human team had achieved what was supposed to be impossible. They weren't just surviving the opening phases of the campaign. They were winning. By the 30-minute mark of the simulation, the Great Hall of the Galactic Military Academy had become a study in contrasts. On one side, alien cadet teams worked frantically at their stations, their carefully planned strategies crumbling as they faced situations their training had never prepared them for. On the other side, the human team seemed almost relaxed, chatting casually as they systematically dismantled challenges that had frustrated the galaxy's best minds for a decade. Lisa Carter was having the time of her life. The simulation's economic systems were more complex than anything she had encountered on Earth, but they followed the same basic principles she had learned on Wall Street. Supply and demand, market manipulation, artificial scarcity. The concepts were universal even if the scale was galactic. "Tyler, I need you to spread a rumor that we're about to capture the Vortex mining station," she said without looking up from her screens. "Make it sound like we accidentally let the information slip during a communication with the 5th Fleet." "But we're not actually going to attack the mining station, are we?" Tyler asked, already composing the message that would be accidentally transmitted on an open channel. "Of course not. We're going to hit the Nexus trade hub instead. But when the enemy moves half their fleet to defend Vortex, the price of processed minerals is going to spike across the entire sector. I've already bought futures contracts on everything they'll need to rebuild their supply chain. Amy looked up from her Alliance Management console with a bemused expression. Are you seriously planning to profit from a war that isn't actually happening? The simulation thinks it's real, Lisa replied with a grin. And the economic systems are fully functional. Why shouldn't we make money while we're saving the galaxy? Meanwhile, Ryan was implementing what he called aggressive fleet redeployment, but what looked like complete madness to anyone trained in galactic military doctrine. His ships were scattered across 17 star systems, moving in patterns that seemed to have no strategic purpose. But there was a method to the madness that only became clear when viewed from a gaming perspective. Jake, I need you to authorize a full retreat from the Kepler sector, Ryan said, his fingers dancing across the interface controls. We just captured Kepler, Jake replied. Why would we retreat? Because the AI thinks we're trying to hold it. Look at the enemy response patterns. They're sending everything they have to retake the system. But if we pull out now and let them have it back, they'll consolidate their forces there to prevent us from attacking again. And then? Ryan's smile was almost predatory. And then we hit the Sigma quadrant with everything we've got while their fleet is parked 3 systems away defending empty space. It was the kind of strategy that would be considered cowardly retreat by galactic standards, but it was perfectly normal for anyone who had grown up playing competitive strategy games. Give up ground to gain advantage, sacrifice pieces to win. The game. Make your opponent think they're winning right up until the moment they lose everything. Tyler had taken psychological warfare to levels that horrified the alien observers. His latest scheme involved sending completely honest reports about human activities to enemy commanders, knowing that the truth was so outrageous that they would assume it was disinformation. Admiral Korthvin, this is a priority intelligence. Update. Tyler broadcast on an open channel that he knew the enemy was monitoring. Human forces are planning to capture your command ship by ramming it with an unmanned cargo vessel loaded with mining explosives. The attack will occur during your inspection of the Third Fleet in approximately 6 hours. This is not a deception. We are actually going to try this. The message was completely accurate. Tyler really was planning to ram an enemy command ship with an explosive cargo vessel. But the plan was so ridiculous, so contrary to every principle of civilized warfare, that the enemy commanders would never believe it was real. They would assume it was a distraction from the real attack and position their forces accordingly. That's horrible, Amy said, listening to Tyler's broadcast. You're telling them exactly what you're going to do and they still won't be able to stop it. It's only horrible if you think there are rules, Tyler replied. But this is war, not a gentleman's club. The objective is to win, not to win nicely. Amy had her own contribution to the chaos. Her approach to alliance management was based on the assumption that every species in the coalition had their own agenda, their own fears, and their own price. Instead of trying to coordinate 12 different species as equals, she was treating each relationship as a separate negotiation. The Vegans are pacifists, so they don't want to fight, she explained to Jake. But they're also traitors, so they want the war to end quickly so they can get back to business. If we promise them exclusive trading rights in any territory we capture, they'll support us completely. What about the Spartan Empire? Jake asked. The Spartans want to fight, but they want to fight honorably, so we let them lead the big dramatic fleet battles that everyone will remember, while we handle the sneaky stuff they're too proud to do themselves. They get the glory, we get the results. And the Andromedans? Amy's expression turned calculating. The Andromedans are the problem. They're too smart to be fooled and too advanced to be bribed, but they're also perfectionists, and perfectionists hate chaos. So we give them something to organize. We make them think they're managing our logistics, while we handle the actual fighting. It was a masterclass in human psychology applied to interspecies relations. Each allied species was getting exactly what they wanted most, which meant they were all happy to support human operations, even when those operations violated every principle of civilized warfare. Jake coordinated it all with a level of multitasking that amazed even Admiral Zarath. Most galactic species could focus intensely on a single problem, but they struggled to manage multiple complex situations simultaneously. Jake was running an economic war, a propaganda campaign, a multi-front military offensive, a diplomatic negotiation, and a psychological operations program all at the same time, switching between them as easily as changing channels on a television. The alien cadet teams were beginning to panic. Feltar had given up on his historical precedents entirely and was frantically trying to adapt to situations that had never occurred in any previous conflict. His careful battle plans were useless against opponents who changed their strategy every few minutes based on what appeared to be random whims. "They're not following any logical pattern," Feltar complained to his teammates. "One minute they're retreating, the next minute they're attacking. They make alliances and break them within hours. They tell their enemies exactly what they're going to do, then do it anyway. It's like fighting against insanity itself." Crixnall was having similar problems. His mathematical models had become increasingly complex as he tried to account for human behavior, but every new calculation seemed to make the situation less predictable rather than more. The humans weren't just thinking outside the box. They were acting as if the box didn't exist. "I need more data," Crixnall muttered, adding another variable to his analysis. "There has to be a pattern. There has to be some underlying logic to what they're doing." But there wasn't a pattern, at least not one that made sense to minds trained in galactic military doctrine. The humans were improvising, adapting, and responding to opportunities as they arose. They had no master plan beyond win the war, and they were willing to use any method that worked, regardless of whether it was considered proper or civilized. The simulation's AI was beginning to show signs of strain. It had been programmed to respond to traditional military strategies, but the humans weren't using traditional strategies. They were using economic warfare, psychological manipulation, diplomatic treachery, and tactical approaches that existed in logical gray areas of the program. Enemy fleets began making increasingly desperate moves as their AI commanders tried to counter tactics that their programming had never anticipated. Supply lines that should have been secure were under constant attack. Political alliances that should have been stable were collapsing due to human manipulation. Economic systems that should have been predictable were swinging wildly between boom and bust cycles. Admiral Zarath watched from the observation deck with growing fascination and alarm. The humans had not only survived the opening phases of the simulation that typically eliminated most teams within the first few months, they had actually gained significant ground against supposedly superior forces. Their success was undeniable, but their methods challenged everything the galactic military establishment believed about proper warfare. "Ma'am," her aide whispered, "should we intervene? The simulation parameters are beginning to exceed design limits." Admiral Zarath considered the question. The humans were clearly breaking the simulation, but they weren't technically breaking any rules. They were just using approaches that no civilized species would ever consider. The question was whether that represented innovative thinking or dangerous barbarism. "Let it continue," she decided. "I want to see how far they can push this." The 50-minute mark was approaching, and the atmosphere in the Great Hall had shifted from confident preparation to barely controlled chaos. Warning lights blinked across multiple monitoring stations as the simulation's systems struggled to process events that had never been programmed into their databases. Admiral Zarath stood at the observation deck, her forearms gripping the railing as she watched the impossible unfold before her eyes. On the main tactical display, the war map showed a situation that defied every principle of galactic military science. The human forces, which should have been eliminated within the first few simulated months, had not only survived, but were systematically dismantling an enemy that was supposed to be unbeatable. Their territory had expanded to cover nearly half of the contested space, and their economic indicators showed growth rates that the simulation's designers had assumed were mathematically impossible during wartime. Lisa Carter was practically bouncing in her chair as she watched market prices fluctuate across her screens. The galactic economy, at least within the simulation, was responding to her manipulations in ways that would have made her rich beyond imagination, if any of it had been real. She had created 3 separate economic bubbles in key enemy sectors, crashed the market for military-grade metals, and cornered the supply of a rare element needed for faster-than-light communication. "Tyler, I need you to leak information that we're going to attack the central banking hub," she called out, her eyes never leaving the scrolling numbers on her display. "Are we actually going to attack it?" Tyler asked, already preparing another of his psychological warfare broadcasts. "Absolutely not. But when enemy forces move to defend it, they'll create a supply shortage in the outer rim. I've already positioned our cargo ships to fill that gap at triple the normal rates." Amy looked over from her Alliance management station with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Lisa, you do realize you're essentially holding the galaxy's economy hostage, right?" "Only the parts we need to win the war," Lisa replied cheerfully. "Everything else can continue operating normally." Ryan had moved beyond unconventional tactics into what could only be described as pure chaos theory applied to space warfare. His fleet movements had become so unpredictable that even the human team sometimes lost track of what he was trying to accomplish. But somehow, it was working. Enemy forces that tried to intercept his ships found themselves chasing ghosts, while his real objectives were achieved by vessels that appeared to be completely out of position. "Jake, I need authorization to abandon the Epsilon defense line," Ryan said, his fingers moving across the interface with practiced ease. "We've been holding that line for 20 minutes, Jake replied. "It's the key to the entire sector." "Exactly. The enemy expects us to defend it, so they've positioned their entire third armada to break through. But if we pull back and let them have it, they'll advance into what they think is empty space." "Except it won't be empty space." Ryan's grin was almost feral. "I've been moving cargo ships loaded with mining explosives into that sector for the past 10 minutes. When their fleet advances, they'll be flying into the biggest minefield in galactic history." It was the kind of strategy that violated every rule of civilized warfare. Using civilian cargo vessels as weapons was considered a war crime by galactic standards. But it wasn't technically against the simulation's rules because no one had ever imagined that anyone would try such a thing. Tyler had escalated his psychological warfare to levels that were causing actual distress among the alien observers. His latest scheme involved convincing enemy commanders that their own allies were planning to betray them. The brilliant part was that he wasn't actually lying. He was just accelerating natural political tensions that already existed within the enemy coalition. "This is Admiral Tyler Brooks of the Human Coalition," he broadcast on a channel he knew was being monitored by multiple enemy factions. "We have intercepted communications indicating that the hegemony forces are planning to withdraw from the war once they secure the mineral rights to the Tartarus system. We thought the Confederation should know about this development, since you're the ones currently dying to defend Confederation territory, while the hegemony profits from your sacrifice." The message was carefully crafted to sound like intelligence sharing, rather than deliberate manipulation. But Tyler knew that both the hegemony and the Confederation were already suspicious of each other's motives. All he had to do was give them a reason to act on those suspicions. "That's diabolical," Amy observed, listening to Tyler's broadcast. "You're making them destroy themselves." "I'm just providing information," Tyler replied innocently. "What they do with that information is their choice." Amy had her own contribution to the accelerating chaos. Her Alliance management had evolved into something that resembled a complex shell game, with different species being told different versions of the same plan, depending on what would motivate them most effectively. The Vegans thought they were supporting a quick, profitable war. The Spartans believed they were engaged in a glorious battle for galactic freedom. The Andromedans were convinced they were participating in a carefully calculated strategic operation. All of them were right in a way, but none of them understood the full scope of what the humans were actually doing. "The Centaurian Collective is getting nervous," Amy reported to Jake. "They're starting to ask questions about our long-term objectives." "What kind of questions?" "Specifically, they want to know what we plan to do with all the territory we're capturing. They're worried we're building an empire instead of just winning a war." Jake considered this for a moment. The truth was that the human team hadn't really thought about what would happen after they won. They were so focused on the immediate challenge of solving the unsolvable simulation that they hadn't considered the long-term implications of their success. "Tell them we'll hold a galaxy-wide referendum on territorial governance once the war is over," Jake decided. Every species gets to vote on how their systems are administered. Will we actually do that? If this were real. Probably. But since it's a simulation, it doesn't matter. We just need to keep them happy for another few minutes. The alien cadet teams were in complete disarray. Veltar had stopped trying to follow historical precedent entirely, and was frantically attempting to create new strategies to counter opponents who seemed to change their approach every few minutes. His careful, methodical nature was completely unsuited to the chaotic, fast-paced environment the humans had created. I don't understand. Veltar complained to his teammates. Everything they do should be impossible. They're fighting on 12 different fronts simultaneously, managing an economy that should have collapsed weeks ago and maintaining alliances with species that hate each other. How are they doing this? Crixinal had given up on mathematical analysis entirely. His computational models had become so complex that they were taking longer to calculate than the events they were trying to predict. By the time his systems finished analyzing a human strategy, the humans had already moved on to something completely different. They're not following any logical pattern because there is no logical pattern, Crixinal finally admitted. They're just reacting to whatever happens, whenever it happens, using whatever method seems most effective at the moment. But that's not how warfare works, protested Zenthali from the Stellar Consortium team. You can't just improvise your way through a galactic conflict. Apparently you can, Crixinal replied, staring at the tactical display where human forces continued their impossible advance. The simulation's monitoring systems were beginning to display error messages as they tried to process events that exceeded their programming parameters. The AI controlling enemy forces was making increasingly irrational decisions as it attempted to counter tactics that its algorithms couldn't understand. Supply lines that should have been secure were under constant attack. Political alliances that should have been stable were collapsing daily. Economic systems that should have followed predictable patterns were swinging wildly between extremes. Admiral Zarath watched it all with a mixture of fascination and growing alarm. The humans had done more than just survive the simulation that had frustrated the galaxy's best minds for a decade. They had broken it. They had taken a carefully balanced system designed to be challenging but fair and turned it into something unrecognizable. Ma'am, her aide whispered urgently. The simulation core is showing signs of instability. If this continues, we may experience a complete system failure. How much longer until the simulation reaches the 1-hour mark? Admiral Zarath asked. 7 minutes and 38 seconds. Admiral Zarath looked at the human team, still chatting casually as they systematically destroyed challenges that had defeated thousands of previous candidates. They seemed almost bored by the whole affair, as if dismantling galactic civilization was just another day at the office. Let it run, she decided. I want to see how this ends. At exactly 57 minutes and 32 seconds into the simulation, something unprecedented happened in the Great Hall of the Galactic Military Academy. Every screen displaying the Crimson Nebula campaign suddenly flashed the same message, in dozens of galactic languages. Coalition victory, enemy forces eliminated, simulation complete. For a moment, the massive chamber fell completely silent. Hundreds of alien cadets stared at their displays in disbelief, while Admiral Zarath and her staff stood frozen at the observation deck. The impossible had happened. The simulation that had frustrated the galaxy's greatest military minds for 10 years had been solved in less than an hour. The silence was broken by Tyler Brooks, who leaned back in his chair and stretched casually. Well, that was fun. Is there anything more challenging, or was this supposed to be the hard one? Jake Morrison was studying the final statistics scrolling across his screen with mild interest. The human coalition had achieved total victory with minimal losses, controlled 73% of all contested territory, and maintained economic growth rates that the simulation's designers had assumed were impossible during wartime. Most remarkably, they had done it while keeping all 12 allied species not only satisfied, but actively enthusiastic about continued cooperation. So what exactly happened in the end? Amy asked, reviewing the political data from the final moments of the campaign. Tyler convinced the enemy factions to destroy each other, Jake explained. Lisa crashed their economy so badly that they couldn't afford to keep fighting. Ryan's cargo ship minefield eliminated their main fleet, and Amy kept our allies happy enough that they were actually sending us reinforcements instead of demanding we solve their problems. It was a team effort, Lisa added, still watching market numbers even though the simulation was over. Though I have to say, galactic economics are much more fun than Earth stock markets. So many more variables to manipulate. Ryan was already shutting down his interface, his attention already moving on to other things. The AI wasn't actually that smart once you figured out its patterns. It kept trying to respond to traditional strategies even when we weren't using any. Like fighting a chess master who insists on playing by chess rules when you're actually playing poker. Admiral Zarath descended from the observation deck on unsteady legs, her forearms trembling slightly as she approached the human command station. Around the hall, alien cadets were slowly emerging from their own stations, their expressions ranging from awe to horror to complete bewilderment. How? Admiral Zarath asked simply. 10 years. Our best strategists, our most advanced artificial intelligences, our greatest military theorists. None of them could solve this simulation. How did you do it in less than an hour? Jake looked genuinely puzzled by the question. We just tried to win. Was there supposed to be something more complicated than that? But the strategies you used, Admiral Zarath continued, they violate every principle of civilized warfare. Economic manipulation, psychological operations, tactical deception, alliance management through false promises, these are not the methods of honorable soldiers. No, Lisa agreed cheerfully. They're the methods of people who want to win wars quickly so they can go home to their families. Tyler nodded. Honor doesn't matter much if you're dead, and your enemies certainly weren't worried about fighting. Honorably, Amy added her own perspective. Every species in our alliance got exactly what they wanted most. The Vegans got profitable trade agreements. The Spartans got glorious battles. The Andromedans got to organize complex logistics operations. Everyone was happy because everyone was getting something out of the arrangement. But you lied to them, protested Veltar, who had approached the group with several other alien cadets. You told each species different versions of your plans. You made promises you had no intention of keeping. We told each species the parts of the truth that would motivate them most effectively, Amy corrected. And we kept every promise we made. The Vegans did get their trade agreements. The Spartans did get their glorious battles. The Andromedans did get to manage our logistics. Everyone got exactly what we promised them. You just didn't tell them about the parts that didn't concern them, Ryan added. Why would we? It would just have confused the situation. Crixnell was staring at his computational device, which was still trying to process the final data from the simulation. The mathematical probability of your success was less than 0.003% when the simulation began. Even accounting for all known variables, what you accomplished should have been impossible. Maybe your math was wrong, Tyler suggested. Or maybe you weren't accounting for all the variables. What variables? Crixnell demanded. Jake thought about it for a moment. Adaptability, maybe? We didn't have a master plan because we didn't know enough about galactic warfare to make one. So we just figured things out as we went along. But that's not how military campaigns work, Veltar insisted. You need strategies, logistics, careful planning, coordination between different units. You can't just improvise your way through a galactic war. Why not? Lisa asked. Improvisation worked fine for us. The alien cadets seemed to struggle with this concept. Their entire military education was based on the idea that warfare was a science, with established principles and proven methodologies. The notion that someone could simply ignore all of that and still succeed was fundamentally disturbing to their worldview. Admiral Zarath was facing her own crisis of understanding. The humans had not only solved the unsolvable simulation, they had done so using methods that challenged every assumption about proper military conduct. Their success was undeniable, but the implications were staggering. The simulation is designed to be won through superior strategy and tactical brilliance, she explained, trying to make sense of what had happened. It rewards careful planning, logical decision-making, and adherence to proven military principles. Maybe that's why nobody could solve it, Amy suggested. You were all trying to win the same way that the original commanders lost. We didn't know enough about the historical campaign to make that mistake. So you succeeded because you were ignorant? Admiral Zarath asked, the concept clearly difficult for her to accept. We succeeded because we were flexible, Jake corrected. We didn't know what we were supposed to do, so we just did what seemed to work. Tyler was examining the simulation interface with the expression of someone who had just finished a mildly entertaining puzzle. The real question is whether this was actually supposed to be challenging, or if everyone else has just been overthinking it. The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. If 5 humans with no formal training in galactic military doctrine could solve the Academy's greatest challenge in less than an hour, what did that say about the effectiveness of galactic military doctrine itself? Admiral Zarath looked around, the great hall at the hundreds of alien cadets who had been defeated by opponents they had initially dismissed as primitive barbarians from a backward world. Many of them were still staring at their displays, trying to understand how their carefully prepared strategies had been so completely outmaneuvered. What happens now? She asked quietly. Jake shrugged. That depends on you. We've proven that the simulation can be solved. Whether you want to change how you teach warfare based on what we've shown you is up to you. But the methods you used, Admiral Zarath protested weakly. They're so ruthless, so unpredictable, so effective, Ryan suggested. The word hit, like a physical blow. Effective. That was exactly what the human methods had been. They might violate every principle of civilized warfare. They might be considered barbaric by galactic standards, but they worked. In less than an hour, they had accomplished what the galaxy's best minds couldn't achieve in 10 years. Lisa was already packing up her personal items, apparently ready to move on to whatever came next. So, is there a graduation ceremony or something? Because I've got plans for lunch and this was supposed to be the big final exam. Tyler nodded in agreement. Yeah, this was fun and all, but it barely took longer than a typical lunch break back home. Don't you have any more challenging simulations we could try? The casual dismissal of their greatest achievement was perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. To the humans, solving the impossible simulation wasn't a momentous victory. It was just another problem they had encountered and dealt with in the most efficient way possible. Admiral Zarath realized that the galaxy was about to face a fundamental choice. They could continue teaching warfare the way they always had, using the civilized, honorable methods that had resulted in 10 years of failure. Or they could acknowledge that these strange beings from the death world called Earth might have something to teach them about winning wars. The thought terrified her almost as much as it intrigued her. If humanity's integration into galactic society was going to be this disruptive to their most basic assumptions about military strategy, what would happen when humans started applying their chaotic, adaptive thinking to other aspects of galactic civilization? As the 5 human cadets walked casually out of the Great Hall, still chatting among themselves about lunch plans and weekend activities, Admiral Zarath knew that the galaxy had just changed in ways that no one was prepared for.